A three-time high school dropout walks into the National Museum of Wales, raises a camera to his eye, looks through the viewfinder at a carved megalithic stone the size of a refrigerator, and blurts out, "It's a map!" That moment in 2011 may turn out to be the most consequential accidental discovery in the history of archaeology. Today, we are unpacking the linguistic theory behind what the author calls iconographic writing, specifically how archaic cartography actually worked, what the spiral glyph that appears on nearly every pre-Roman monument in Europe actually encodes, and why a technique taught in U.S. Army basic training is the skeleton key to reading 79,000 years of human history. I am joined by someone who has gone very deep into this research, and I want to start right at the beginning. What exactly did an unknown soldier find, and why does it matter?
So the research begins with a writing system. The author calls it iconographic writing, and the first thing to understand is that it is fundamentally different from every writing system we currently recognize. It does not modulate verbal information, it modulates visual information. And that distinction is everything.
Right, so it is not encoding sounds or words.
Exactly. The research describes it in strict linguistic terms as a system where an index forms the primary container for all other elements of a composition. Think of it like a binder. The binder itself has a shape, and everything inside the binder relates to that shape. And the shape of the binder, this is the part that stops you cold, is always a map.
A map of what, though?
A map of the realm being documented. The research states this as Rule 1 of compositional syntax. The constitution had to look just like the realm it documented. So the borders and general details of every composition were based on cartography. The king had to look like the kingdom. That is Rule 2. And every station of the nobility had to be represented by icons within the boundary of the realm, almost always in geophysical relationship to each other. That is Rule 3.
So when you look at, say, an Egyptian god with a falcon head, the research is saying that is not mythology, that is a map of a region that happens to look like a falcon.
That is precisely what the research argues. Horus, for example, the research identifies the geology west of the Nile as resembling a perched Egyptian black kite. The founding iconography depicts Horus in full avian form, but the king would always wear a Horus headdress because the king had to look like the kingdom. And the Great Pyramids of Giza, according to the research, are situated precisely on the nose of Horus in that geological composition, because in archaic iconography, the nose was always the sovereign's mountain.
That is a lot to absorb. But let's back up, because before we can get to Egypt, we need to understand how the cartography itself worked. How did people in 9,300 BC actually make a map?
And this is where the research gets genuinely elegant, because the method is so simple it is almost embarrassing. The author learned it in US Army basic training. You take a stick, you plant it in the ground, you place a stone on the tip of its shadow, that is point A. You wait 15 minutes, the sun moves, the shadow moves. You place another stone on the tip of the new shadow, that is point B. You draw a line between A and B. That line is a perfect east-west axis every time.
And the research claims that is more accurate than GPS?
The research does make that claim, yes. Modern GPS satellites are accurate to within a few meters, which is fine for getting from A to B. But when you are trying to extend a line across the horizon, even a few meters of initial error compounds dramatically over distance. The sun and stick method, performed correctly, does not have that compounding error in the same way.
So the archaic priests, and the research is clear that priests were the professorial class until the Enlightenment, they were using this technique as their primary surveying tool.
Yes, and the research calls this practice soloromancy. Because the sun was regarded as the exclusive instrument of God, the process of cartography was not regarded as a science, it was regarded as a process of divination. The soloromancer was a caste of the clergy dedicated to the interpretation of solar phenomena. Their primary tool was a staff. Any stick would do, but the longer the staff, the lower the error rate.
Which reframes the whole idea of a priestly staff as a piece of surveying equipment.
Completely. And the research extends that to Moses specifically. The argument is that Moses spent 40 years in the kingdom of Midian as an apprentice soloromancer, watching flocks on the Sinai Peninsula. Every time he moved camp, he would align his robe to the east-west line of solar progress, use his staff to measure the direction, the azimuth, to every prominent feature on the horizon, and trace those lines onto his robe. His wife Zipporah would then embroider the data permanently.
So Moses' robe was literally a map.
After 40 years of surveying the Sinai Peninsula, yes. The research argues that after enough passes along the shepherd's progress, the intersecting lines of sight would resolve into a contour map of the ridgelines and wadis of the region. And the image that emerged, the research is very specific about this, was a bush engulfed in flames that was not consumed.
Wait, the burning bush?
The burning bush. The research argues that the Mosaic Epiphany was the moment Moses recognized that the cartographic pattern on his own robe was a visual analogue for what he had been witnessing in his dreams, the image of a bush engulfed in fire that was not consumed. The research states, and I think this is worth quoting directly, "I no longer doubt a single word of Exodus, for with this technique, Moses guided me to precisely where he parted the Red Sea."
That is one of the more remarkable things I have heard in a long time. But let's come back to the stone in Wales, because that is where the discovery actually starts. What is the Bryn Celli Dhu pattern stone?
So the stone was discovered buried beneath a mound on the Isle of Anglesey in 1928 or 1929, depending on which part of the research you are reading. And it was, in archaeological contexts, radiocarbon dated to around 3,500 BC. It is the size of a large refrigerator, roughly a third of its mass below grade when it was found. The National Museum of Wales had it on display, and the consensus interpretation was that the interlaced ribbon patterns on both faces were an early form of Celtic knotwork.
And the author walks in, raises a camera, and sees something completely different.
Through the viewfinder, the lines on the stone looked remarkably similar to the terrain contours on a topographic map, the kind the author had learnt to read in the army. The immediate reaction was that it was a map, which the author immediately dismissed as impossible for 3,500 BC. Back at a flat in Cardiff that night, the author increased the contrast and saturation of the photographs and traced the lines to clarify the composition.
And what did the tracing reveal?
A crude map of a portion of the British Isles. The research identifies the Lizard Peninsula, Wales, the Irish Sea, the Stranraer Peninsula, and Ireland on the front face of the stone. Ireland is compressed, which the research attributes to the error characteristics of low-tech cartographical methods, but the correlation is there. The author's landlady in Cardiff agreed it was close enough to be concerning, either a genuine ancient map or a very sophisticated piece of antiquities fraud.
And the fraud hypothesis is actually what drove the initial investigation.
Entirely. The author reported the finding to Welsh authorities, met with the Cabinet Secretary for Education and Culture, and proposed a logical test. If cartography was operative in the British Isles in 3,500 BC, we would expect to find evidence of it everywhere. The plan was to spend a few weeks cataloguing the lack of evidence elsewhere, confirm the stone was a fraud, and move on. Instead, the author spent 6 months in the United Kingdom finding cartographically based iconography everywhere.
So the fraud hypothesis collapsed under the weight of corroborating evidence.
It did, but the decisive moment came in Stranraer, Scotland. The stone documents an isthmus connecting Ireland to Scotland, which was laughable to everyone the author discussed it with. An isthmus of Ireland simply does not exist. So the author used software to model sea levels at various points in history and found that an isthmus does form between Ireland and Scotland when sea levels are at least 36 metres lower than they are today.
And sea levels were last that low when?
According to the research, sea levels were last 36 metres lower than today in 9,300 BC, which is 5,800 years earlier than the 3,500 BC date when the stone was buried. The stone cannot be radiocarbon dated because it is stone, only the organic material found above it was dated. So we know when it was buried, not when it was carved. And the presence of an isthmus that only existed in 9,300 BC means the carving must date to within living memory of that geological feature.
That is the geological timestamp argument.
Exactly. And the fraud hypothesis dies right there. The research makes this point very clearly. In 1928, when the stone was discovered, nobody, not even the Royal Navy, had accurate seafloor data for the Irish Sea. A forger would have had to know about that submerged seabed feature in 1928 to include it in a fraudulent map. The author went to Stranraer and confirmed the feature with a local fisherman using sonar sounding from a fish finder. The submerged isthmus was precisely where the software predicted it would be, 36 meters below current sea levels.
So the stone is authentic. It dates to around 9,300 BC, and it is a map.
Which raises the obvious question, how was the map made? What was the compass? This is where the research introduces what I think is one of its most compelling arguments. The author was on the Isle of Anglesey visiting the Bryn Celli Du mound when the answer presented itself. Ammonites, fossilized spiral shells, are found ubiquitously on every beach in the British Isles. The geometry of the ammonite, specifically its radial lines pointing in every possible direction from a central coil, makes it a natural compass.
Oh, so the coil that appears on virtually every pre-Roman monument in Northern Europe, that is not decorative. That is a compass.
The research argues it is a cartographer's ranging grid. The coil is the archaic equivalent of the Cartesian grid we use in modern cartography. Instead of a square grid, archaic cartographers used a spiral emanating from the point of the survey. The research even suggests the military should consider adopting the coil grid over the Cartesian grid because it is a superior ranging device. You only need an azimuth and a range to the target, rather than a full coordinate conversion.
And the error rate in the coil grid actually tells you something about the tools used to make the map.
Yes, and this is a genuinely elegant methodological point. The research found that the error rate in archaic cartographs increases the further you range from the center of the coil, exactly as you would predict if the error compounds with distance from the survey point. By measuring the error rate in the images, you can predict the error rate in the tools used to make them. And by predicting the error rate in the tools, you can predict the designs of the compasses used.
Which means the maps are self-documenting in a way. They carry the fingerprint of their own instruments.
Precisely. And the research found a physical example of one of those instruments in the same Welsh museum where the patterned stone was on display, a decorative flint mace head. The museum label described it as bling used to impress the impressionable. The research argues it was a functional compass, mounted on a staff cut to eye level with radial lines carved into its surface. You align the horizontal line to the east-west solar axis, look across the surface of the mace head at a distant object, note which radial line it aligns with, and you have plotted an azimuth.
So the mace head is Merlin's compass.
That is exactly what the research calls it. The author chose the name Merlin for the professional class of archaic scribes, partly because the author tired of calling them druids, and partly because the research argues Merlin may have been a real title or epithet of official office in pre-Roman times, not a mythical character. The research states, "I have maps which are about to prove that as fact."
Let's talk about the Maasai, because that example from the research is striking. The regalia shield of the Maasai of Kenya, what does the research say about that?
The Maasai regalia shield is one of the research's most powerful demonstrations that this iconographic system was global. The arcs embellishing the shield are solar arcs. They document the sun's movements at various times of the year. The middle arc documents the medial arc of the sun's annual progress. The outermost arcs document the southern maximal arc and the northern maximal arc, and two smaller interior arcs document the solar arc of the winter solstice, as seen from both the southern and northern perspectives simultaneously.
So the shield documents the sun's behavior from two different hemispheric perspectives at once.
From the perspective of a kingdom to the south and a kingdom to the north. The research makes the point that the bearer of this shield was not just carrying their own solar data, they were carrying the solar data of their neighbors. Everyone's perspective was taken into consideration, and the spear of the Maasai warrior functioned as the needle on the sundial. The research is very direct. The Maasai were not spear chuckers. They were conducting cartographical surveys with instruments of extraordinary sophistication.
And the research connects this to a broader argument about the out-of-Africa narrative in archaeology.
Yes, and this is one of the more provocative threads in the research. The author argues that 20th century archaeology was skewed by racist assumptions. The archaeologists searched for the missing link in Africa because Africans were presumed by racists to be primitive peoples. The research cites genetic evidence that humans became genetically distinct from chimpanzees 6 million years ago, while archaeology has only uncovered 3.2 million years of hominid remains. That leaves nearly 3 million years of missing links unaccounted for.
And the researchers' alternative hypothesis is that the original cradle of civilization was Australia, not Africa.
Australia, with Arabia, India, and Northern Africa also implicated. The research acknowledges Australia today does not resemble a garden paradise, but argues it is a shadow of its former self, that climate change has been occurring for far longer than accredited academia is willing to admit. The iconographic record, the research argues, begins in 77,000 BC following the Toba eruption in Indonesia, a super eruption along the Pacific Rim that nearly resulted in the extinction of the human species.
That is a staggering chronological claim. 77,000 BC.
And the research points to a specific artifact to support it. A carved piece of red ochre from the Blombos Cave in South Africa, whose deposition on the cave floor has been radiocarbon dated to 75,000 BC. The research argues this artifact proves a more sophisticated method of cartography, called intersection and resection, was in use tens of thousands of years before academic consensus accepts modern cognition.
Let's talk about the compositional syntax in more detail, because the research introduces a concept called the order of precedence that governs how these compositions are read. Can you walk us through that?
So the order of precedence is essentially the grammar of iconographic writing. The research establishes that east was regarded as up, the apex direction, because the sun's progress served as the needle on the compass. East was up, west was down, and iconography facing east is always, without exception, the apex iconography of the realm. The research states it found no variance from this protocol on any continent.
And south takes precedence over north.
South before north, yes. The research explains this through primogeniture, first to come, first to serve. The cardinal order of precedence, east, south, west, north, was determined by the fact that a southern kingdom was founded before a northern kingdom when the iconographic record began, around 79,000 BC. The clockwise direction we use on clocks today is derived from the sunwise direction of the sundial. Clocks are, as the research puts it, just an adaptation on sundials.
I had never thought about that. The clock face is a sundial.
And the research uses that to explain why misreading the order of precedence is so catastrophic for interpretation. Mistake or misread the order of precedence and you are reading fiction. Adhere to the protocols of the nobility and fiction resolves to factual histories. The research is very firm on this point.
Now, the research also introduces a concept called containership. What is that?
Containership is described as the primary rule of compositional syntax. Because every realm had kingdoms within kingdoms, the research uses the analogy of towns within counties, counties within states, states within nations. The apex compositions reflect that modular structure. The edges of archaic books, so to speak, had to appear like the realm to which everything within refers. But not everything inside the borders had to be based on cartography. Iconographic writing is composed of both cartographs and what the research calls demographs.
So a cartograph documents the physical terrain, and a demograph documents the people and institutions within it.
Exactly. And the research argues that because all demographs within a realm's borders were arrayed in strict observation of the order of precedence, and that order mirrored the celestial progress, the author is able to confirm that the elder religion which yielded this writing system was practiced on every continent prior to 1500 BC.
Let's come back to the Brincelli du stone, because the research describes a very specific political structure that the stone was documenting. The realm of three brothers.
Yes. The research argues that in 9300 BC, a sovereign father called Re reigned as arbiter in common between three kingdoms in the British Isles. The sovereign's court was called Rath na Rai, the Court of Rai, and it was located on what was then the Peninsula of Man, the Isle of Man. On the periphery of that court were installed three megalithic carvings, the megalith of the east, the megalith of the west, and the megalith of the north.
And the Brincelli du patterned stone is one of those three megaliths.
The research believes so. Each megalith functioned as what the research calls a spreadsheet, documenting the balances of resources in trade between each pair of kingdoms. Three kingdoms produce 6 reciprocal relationships, requiring 3 volumes with 2 tables each. The inverse perspective of Scotland on the reverse side of the stone, one face oriented north to south, the other south to north, is explained by the fact that each cartograph was drawn so that each ruling king faced the centre court, just as the planets face the celestial father above.
So the stone is not just a map. It is a constitutional document and an accounting ledger simultaneously.
That is the researcher's argument. And the research goes further. It suggests the other two megaliths may still be on the Isle of Anglesey, possibly used as fill in the construction of the Bryn Celli Dhu mound itself. The research calls on archaeologists to deconstruct the mound carefully and examine the larger stone slabs that were never disarticulated.
Now, the research also discusses the Madre de Occidente, the Lady of the West, found on the Costa del Sol in Spain. How does that fit into the picture?
The Madre de Occidente is described as the most compelling example the author identified. In profile, the composition is revealed to be based on cartography. The research places it next to a satellite image of Spain and Portugal and describes the correlation as nearly irrefutable. The dual crowns of the Madre de Occidente are particularly significant. Where pre-Roman Britons used a coil as a cartographer's grid, Iberians used geometry borrowed from scallop shells.
So different regions develop different compass geometries based on the shells available to them locally.
Ammonites in the British Isles, scallops in Iberia. The result is iconography that becomes regionally idiomatic. You can identify where a composition originates by the geometry of its cartographer's grid. And the research connects this to Plato's account of Atlantis, which the author does not take literally but finds significant because Plato describes Atlantis as the geographical center on which a system for measuring latitude and longitude was based, in other words, a prime meridian.
So Plato was describing a cartographic coordinate system, not a lost continent.
The researcher's reading is that where you have a system for measuring latitude and longitude, you must have had a system for recording it. The concept is irrational in the absence of cartographical method. The research does not claim Atlantis existed, it claims the cartographic system Plato described did exist, and that the iconographic record proves it.
There is a moment in the research where the author reflects on why this discovery was not made by an academic, and the answer is Hitler.
It is a striking passage. The research argues that because the National Socialist Workers' Party plagiarized half of what nobody understood and turned it toward their twisted purpose, archaeologists today are intimidated to offer any narrative of the ancient world that does not result in what the author calls spear checkers and groveling for tubers. Any academic who dared to suggest what the research proves would have lost their tenure. The author's status as a 3-time high school dropout, paradoxically, was the protection that made the discovery possible.
There is something almost poetic about that. The institutional gatekeeping that was supposed to protect knowledge ended up being the thing that prevented it from being found.
The research makes that point with some force, and it extends to the treatment of non-European cultures. The Maasai shield documenting the winter solstice from both hemispheric perspectives simultaneously, the research asks directly, is that stupid, smart, or genius? The answer is self-evident, and it demolishes the cognitive hierarchy that 20th century anthropology implicitly constructed.
The research also makes a claim about the scope of what remains to be done. How large is the iconographic record?
The research estimates over 3,500 artifacts based on cartography that formed the iconographic record. In the British Isles alone, there are over 3 million artifacts in the national collections of England, Wales, Ireland, Scotland, and the Isle of Man. The author calculates that at 5 minutes per artifact, it would take 150 years just to complete a first pass. The research is explicit that the scope of this discovery requires the dedicated efforts of a generation to complete.
And the research argues that the majority of all noble regalia, crowns, tiaras, circlets, can function as compasses.
Yes, each gem on a crown represents a leadership node in the realm. The research states that maps prove cartography and calibrated field navigation was ubiquitous among the world's nobility, which makes sense, because in an age when government sent its representatives to the people rather than the other way around, getting lost along the way was not wise. The Arabian agal, the rope headdress, is described as a compass complete with azimuth indicators. The gold border on Arabian robes represents the line of solar progress.
So the regalia of the Arabian nobility, which we can still observe today, is functional information technology descended from archaic cartographic practice.
That is the researcher's argument, and it extends to textiles more broadly. The research suggests that it was a woman working on a loom who first invented both astronomy and cartography, because women were the weavers in nearly every ancient culture. Zipporah embroidering Moses' robe is not a domestic detail. It is the researcher's argument that women were the primary technologists of the archaic information system.
That is a genuinely striking reframe. The loom as the original data storage device.
And the research suggests that secrets were recorded on the underside of rugs, disguised as finishing knots so as not to draw attention to the information they contained. The permanent designs of Bedouin regalia would feature aspects of kindred life which were immutable, the colours, arms, and locations of every kindred court along the Bedouin progress. Temporary stitching could be added and removed to track accounts and tribute.
I want to ask about the Newgrange Mound in Ireland because the research mentions it specifically. What does the research say about the entrance stone at Newgrange?
The research describes the entrance stone at Newgrange as an ancient hard drive. The coils and diamonds on the stone, which have baffled scholars for centuries, were once the backdrop for an elaborate painting. After carving the necessary geometry, a base coat of chalk and oil-based paint was applied, creating a blank canvas on which demographic data were painted. The research states it is a map of Ireland, featuring the same longitudinal compressions seen on the Bryn Celli Dhu patterned stone, and encourages the audience to trace its lines and add colour using the colours currently used to identify each county of Ireland.
And the research predicts the result would be shocking.
The research says the Irish will be both awed and dismayed, awed at the chronological depths of their own history, and in dismay over their own limited appreciation for what Irish truly means. And then it extends that to everyone. For every Irishman who awakens to discover they are not descended from Celts, there will be 10 Englishmen who awaken to discover they are not descended from Vikings. The same sociocultural dislocation, the research argues, will occur across the planet. The research also makes a claim about Julius Caesar's invasion of Britain that I found remarkable. What happened to the iconographic writing system when Caesar arrived?
The research argues that in the moment of Caesar's invasion, the archaic writing system was promptly abandoned and kept as a closely guarded secret. The reason? Virtually every standing stone in the British Isles was a map identifying the leadership centres of a realm Caesar did not realise existed. Caesar took the British Isles to be peopled by loosely affiliated tribes of barbarians at war with each other. In fact, the research argues, a realm of 3 brothers, their sovereign father Rhi and their sovereign mother Regan, had maintained a literate culture in that corner of Europe for millennia beyond recall.
So the stones were hidden, not because the culture collapsed, but because the culture was protecting itself from a conqueror who would have used the maps against them. That is the research's reading. And it connects to a broader question the author poses. If civilization did not collapse, how did an information technology used throughout the world for millennia just fade from memory? The research describes that question as ominous and does not claim to have the answer.
So when you step back from everything we have covered today, the sun and stick method, the coil as a ranging grid, the Bryn Celli Dhu stone as a 9,300 BC map of the British Isles, the Maasai shield as a solar observatory, Moses' robe as a 40-year cartographic survey, what is the single thread that ties all of it together? The thread is this. Our ancestors were not documenting verbal information, they were documenting visual information. And because they were documenting visual information, the research argues, this discovery will not require legions of experts to explain to us. The maps speak directly to the eye. The research puts it plainly, our ancestors did invent cartography many tens of thousands of years before Christ, and what can no longer be doubted is the cognitive capacity of humans in the most remote archaic.
And the implication for every secular textbook in the humanities department is they all have to be rewritten.
The research is explicit about that. Every secular textbook in the humanities department will have to be rewritten. The religious traditions, interestingly, the research argues have nothing to worry about. The iconographic record, in the author's reading, confirms rather than contradicts the accounts in the Bible, the Quran, the Vedas, the Analects, the Pali Canon, and the Kojiki. It is the academic consensus, not the religious traditions, that the research is overturning.
Here is what this really comes down to, I think. A man trained by the United States Army to find north with a stick and a shadow walked into a museum, looked through a camera lens, and saw something that every credentialed expert had walked past for decades. Not because the experts were stupid, but because the institutional framework they operated within made it professionally dangerous to see it.
And the research is generous about that. The author does not savage the academic community. The point is that the same training that made the discovery possible also made it invisible to people without that training. You cannot see a topographical map in a stone carving if you have never read a topographical map. The army taught the author to read terrain. That is the entire key.
What strikes me most is the actionable invitation at the end of the research. Open a graphics program, trace the lines of the Newgrange entrance stone, add color between the lines using the colors of the modern Irish counties. See what appears. The research is not asking you to take its word for it, it is asking you to look.
And that is consistent with the nature of the writing system itself. Iconographic writing was designed to be read by the eye, not decoded by an expert. The research argues that once you accept the application existed in the Archaic, the majority of all noble regalia, crowns, tiaras, circlets, shields, robes, staffs, resolve from decorative objects into functional instruments. The world's museums are full of compasses and maps that nobody has recognized as such.
3 million artifacts in the British Isles alone. Most of them, the research suggests, with iconographic significance waiting to be interpreted.
And the research closes with a commitment to document over 3,500 artifacts based on cartography that formed the iconographic record, so that all of mankind can return to the archaic cartographer's grid, replot the maps they relied on in their imaginations, and discover who they truly are. That is the scope of what an unknown soldier is proposing.
We started today with a man in a museum blurting out an expletive at a stone, and we are ending with the possibility that every spiral carved on every megalith in Europe, every crown worn by every archaic king, every embroidered robe, every woven rug, every regalia shield, all of it is a library. A library that has been sitting in plain sight for tens of thousands of years, waiting for someone trained to read terrain to walk through the door. That is the research of an unknown soldier.